Jack Smith's second, but first public, House Judiciary Committee hearing. This is a summary. Welcome to Law and Society. Please subscribe and let's jog our memories about what Donald Trump tried to do to our constitutional order. So before I go into actually reading excerpts from this hearing, I'd like to point out a few things. Something happened in the hearing room that caused Officer Dunn, by the way, Officers Dunn, Fanone, Hodges, and Sergeant Gonell were present at the second public hearing. So something happened that caused Officer Dunn to stop Officer Fanone from going after somebody in the audience. It was a MAGA troll who started provoking Officer Fanone, and Fanone replied aggressively. Officer Dunn held Fanone back, and Officer Fanone later told Jim Acosta that this particular troll, and the name escapes me, had been following his family for years and harassing and threatening Fanone's family, and that Fanone had had enough of it. And I stand with Fanone. I also would like to point out that when Representative Troy Nehls blamed the police, Metropolitan Police and Capitol Police, for what happened on January 6th, Fanone coughed, "Go fuck yourself." And I thought that was, it was appropriate, despite the fact that it wasn't part of the decorum, but it was appropriate. Then Ted Lieu brought up how badly Trump and the GOP want to cover up the Epstein files. And he says that the GOP would rather talk about Trump's crimes instead of releasing the Epstein files. That's how bad the information in the Epstein files are. And then I'd like to point out to you that you won't hear me talking much about Republican questions in this summary. And that's because they started and ended by falsely labeling Jack Smith's investigation as politically motivated, absent any proof of that. They didn't let Jack Smith answer any questions they were asking. They interrupted him, insulted him, and said they were disgusted by him. And any GOP representative who tried to find a hole in Smith's work eventually realized that they couldn't find one, like Representative Laura Lee. They were also going heavy on the phone records and the toll record subpoena, and then I'll read to you later on how Ted Lieu shut them down about that. So with that said, let's talk about the excerpts, and I'll read you some of the excerpts from the hearing. I have put the whole hearing testimony in the description box, and along with that, I've done something different. I couldn't find the transcript for this public hearing, so I have added clips by Aaron Rupar and Scott MacFarlane of CBS and Aaron Rupar of Public Notice, who habitually and for years have been patriotically providing the American people with relevant clips from government hearings and other government conferences or any other sort of news that comes out. So I used those excerpts because I couldn't find the transcript. Jamie Raskin reminds the committee of what Jack Smith said in the first hearing. He asked if Donald Trump was responsible. If Donald Trump was responsible for January 6th, Jack Smith said, "Our review of the evidence was that Trump caused it, exploited it, and it was foreseeable to him." Jack Smith starts out by saying, "I love my country and believe deeply in the core principles on which it was founded. For nearly 3 decades, I've served as a career prosecutor in both Republican and Democrat administrations. I have no partisan loyalties. My career has been devoted to upholding the rule of law." Trump was charged because evidence established he willfully broke the law, the very laws he took an oath to uphold. After leaving office, Trump illegally kept classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago social club. Highly sensitive national security information was held in a ballroom and a bathroom. Trump sought to seek revenge against career prosecutors, FBI agents, and support staff simply for having worked on these cases. To vilify and seek retribution against these people is wrong. I have seen how the rule of law can erode. My fear is that we have seen the rule of law function in our country for so long that many of us come to take it for granted. The rule of law is not self-executing. It depends on our collective commitment to apply it. It requires dedicated service on behalf of others, especially when that service is difficult and comes with cost. Our willingness to pay those costs tests and defines our commitment to the rule of law and this wonderful country. Jamie Raskin. The people who attacked the police officers on January 6th were chanting "Hang Mike Pence." I suppose that was political speech, that they were saying "Stop the steal." Does that mean that they have a First Amendment defense of violent assault against officers? Jack Smith. No. Representative Nadler. Your problem was not determining if you had enough evidence to charge Donald Trump. Rather, you might have had too much evidence and a struggle to determine how to represent a clear narrative to a jury. How would you characterize the evidence against Mr. Trump about inciting an insurrection against the laws of this country? Did you have too much? Smith. One of the central challenges was to present that in a concise way because we had so many witnesses. Some of the most powerful witnesses were witnesses who were fellow Republicans who had voted for Donald Trump, who had campaigned for him, and who wanted him to win the election. These included state officials who worked on his campaign and advisor. We didn't charge insurrection looking at the facts and the law. He points that out because Nadler talks about insurrection and Jack Smith wants to correct the record and be accurate about what happened. Then Representative Lofgren asks, Lindsey Graham said that Trump would believe it if you told him Martians had stolen the election. What does that tell you about his state of mind? Jack Smith, Trump was not looking for honest answers about if there was fraud in the election. He was looking for ways to stay in power, and when people told him things that conflicted with him staying in power, he rejected them. Or he chose to not contact people like that who would know whether the election was done properly. When individuals would say things that would allow him to stay in power, no matter how fantastical, he would latch onto those. That pattern over time was powerful evidence that he in fact knew the fraud claims he was making were false. And Jack Smith says this a number of times, and I don't think that Representative Laura Lee really gets it, because she went on and asked about the fact that that Jack Smith had whether he had any evidence of criminal intent or not. And as Jack Smith was trying to explain it, she would interrupt him. Representative Hank Johnson says, Trump's propaganda site says that 2020 election was stolen. Mr. Smith, did your investigation uncover evidence sufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump knew that his claim that the election was stolen was false? Smith, yes, it did. Johnson, did your investigation uncover evidence sufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump publicly claimed that the 2020 election was stolen from him while he privately acknowledged that he had lost the election? Smith, yes, we cited instances of that in our case. Johnson, did your investigation develop any evidence to support the allegation that FBI entrapped insurrectionists into committing crimes on January 6th? Smith, our investigation revealed that Donald Trump is the person who caused January 6th. It was foreseeable to him, and he sought to exploit the violence. Representative Swalwell, they can't erase what happened on January 6th because we saw it with our own eyes. Representative Ted Lieu, how scared are Republicans of talking about Epstein files? They're so scared that they literally are calling Jack Smith. Republicans would rather talk about the criminality of Donald Trump than about his associations with Epstein and his pedophilia ring. Did anybody in the Biden White House ever direct you to seek retribution against anyone seen to be Biden's political opponent? Ted Lieu asks Smith. Smith says no. Did Biden ever post a social media post directing you to seek retribution against any particular individuals? Smith, no. Did Biden ever tell you that Donald Trump should be arrested and punished? Smith, no. Did Biden ever tell you to go after any Biden appointee? Smith, no. Is the Speaker of the House above the law? Liu asks. Smith says, no, I don't believe anybody should be above the law. Then Ted Lieu says, the speech or debate clause, and I would like to just point out that it's the speech or debate clause, but everybody keeps calling it the speech and debate clause. It's kind of a nomenclature problem that I kind of have a little tiff with. But anyway, the speech or debate clause only applies to legislative acts, communications with legislative acts. Stealing a freaking election or trying to do so is not a legislative act. It is a crime. It is not covered by the speech or debate clause. I would like to add in this case that the speech or debate clause is also content-based. It is not the fact that the toll records were called and the toll records provide information about the number that was called, who they were calling, and the duration of the call. It does not go into the content of the call. And the speech or debate clause very much looks at the content of what was being said and whether that was legislative in nature or not in order to trigger the speech or debate clause protection. In this case, that was not a legislative act. Trying to defraud the United States is not a legislative act. Being co-conspirators in that affair is not a legislative act. So Smith says, in this case, the crime was trying to stay in office when they had in fact not won the election. Laura Lee, there too, there's a requirement of intent that he could that his conduct must be knowing and intentional. Isn't that right? Smith, there is an intent requirement. Lee, President received information from multiple advisors and he was regurgitating what they were saying. Isn't that right? Smith, I said that he was making knowing false claims, that he was believing anything that would keep him in office, and he was rejecting. Again, he was interrupted. Would you agree that people were giving Trump conflicting advice at the time? Would you not? Smith, his original campaign staff had told him that he had lost. He fired them and brought in people who would then, and then he gets interrupted by Lee again, by saying criminal liability under statutes you used in your indictment required proving intent, not simply undermining democratic norms or expressing an opinion with which you do not agree. You charged 2 intent crimes without any direct proof whatsoever that the conduct charged was knowing, intentional, or that you'd have an adequate basis to sustain a conviction at trial. Smith says, we had proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I felt that proof included direct testimony from a number of witnesses to prove Trump's knowing falsity of his claims. Representative Lee doesn't seem to understand that you prove criminal intent by showing what Donald Trump did and said, and Jack Smith has all of that information of what Donald Trump did and said, to whom they were said, and whether Donald Trump knew that the false information that he was sharing was false or not. Jack Smith has repeatedly said that we developed very strong evidence of the fact that that did happen. Lee, however, still goes on to say, despite the fact that in your own deposition you acknowledged the existence of conflicting advice, if this defendant were anyone other than Donald Trump, I find it hard to believe that we'd be sitting here today talking about an indictment that was returned knowing the elements of the offenses could not be demonstrated. She isn't understanding what Smith is saying or the evidence Smith has gathered and how that builds the narrative for criminal intent. So she asks, are you familiar with DOJ policy that prohibits prosecutors from selecting the time of investigations and prosecutorial actions for the purpose of affecting any election. Smith, yes, that's the election year sensitivity policy, and we followed it in all respects, and the public integrity section concurred that we followed it in all respects. So with that, Laura Lee stops asking her questions. He's out of time, but she doesn't really get, you can figure out from their questioning that she doesn't get how the trial process works of developing evidence presented to a jury to show criminal intent. Then Steve Cohen goes and asks about the phone records. The phone records that have been so big about, in the Republicans' minds. And Smith says, the subpoenas were secured. We secured with non-disclosure orders from a judge because I had grave concerns about obstruction of justice in this investigation, specifically in regards to Donald Trump. Not only did we have the obstruction of justice that we were investigating in the classified documents case, I was aware in the course of our investigation targeting of witnesses during the course of the conspiracy itself. There were election workers who had their lives turned upside down, vile death threats because they were targeted by Trump and his co-conspirators. I had a duty to protect witnesses in this investigation. Trump suggested one witness should be put to death and issued a statement saying, if you come after me, I'll come after you. In my mind, I cannot think of a more direct threat. In my view, it was completely appropriate to protect the investigation, to protect against destruction of evidence, to protect the witnesses in our case. Cohen continues about the phone records, about what they contain. The toll record gives you who you called, who's the call from, who it is to, and the length of the call. It does not tell the content people were speaking about. I had proved beyond a reasonable doubt and were able to go to trial in the case. So here, it's important to note that toll records do not show the contents of the call. And that is what the speech or debate clause would latch onto if there was content that was being divulged through this evidence gathering. Steve Cohen asks, Representative Cohen says, did Biden, Harris, or Garland or anybody influence you? Smith, I was given the independence to conduct my investigation and I came to the decision to bring charges in this case without undue influence from anybody in the department. Cohen, why did you drop the case? The cases were dropped pursuant to department policy. There had not been a case of this nature before where someone was elected president with charges pending. The Office of Legal Counsel determined cases needed to be dismissed. Then, Representative Neguse, Republicans are trying to rewrite history. Many of them were with us in the House chamber on January 6th. I remember it well. The chairman was there. There had been a lot of discussion about witnesses today. Perhaps the chairman could muster the courage to call the 4 witnesses I see, the 4 police officers who risked everything, life and limb, to do what? To protect the Republican members on the dais. It is an outrage that they now sit here and have the audacity to try to rewrite history in front of the very officers who sacrificed everything to protect them. Jack Smith, AG of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, debunked fraud claims. Also told Trump that there was no outcome determinative fraud in the state. Representative McBath plays the Georgia phone call by Trump to Brad Raffensperger asking the 11,780 votes, and then asks, how did the Secretary of State push back against Trump's efforts? Smith, Trump repeatedly raised fraud claims, and the Secretary repeatedly explained not only that they weren't true, and in several instances explained why they weren't true. The call ended with Trump threatening the Secretary that he might be targeted to criminal prosecution if he didn't do what Trump wanted him to do. McBath, Trump didn't just spread lies about the election. He preyed on Republican officials in Georgia and other states who believed would help him. Trump thought they would break the law out of party loyalty. When those officials told him the truth, he dismissed them and continued to spread the lies anyway. Is that correct? Smith, that is correct. Now, Representative Ross, lawyer for QAnon shaman Jacob Chansley, highlighted how Trump's words affected his client. He heard the words of the president, he believed them, he genuinely believed them, and he thought that the president was actually going to walk with them to the Capitol. Do you believe that Donald motivated and was responsible for the violence that occurred on that day, even if he didn't walk with them to the Capitol? Smith, yes. As we stated in our report, the results of our investigation following the facts and following the law was that Trump was the person most responsible for what happened at the Capitol. And he caused what happened at the Capitol, and that it was foreseeable to him. So, by the way, during this hearing, Trump was live truth socialing while this hearing was ongoing and attacking Jack Smith and threatening prosecution. And when faced with that and asked about that, Jack Smith says, "I will not be intimidated." Then, talking about Trump's mass pardon, Smith says, "The people who assaulted police officers were convicted after trial are dangerous to our community. Some of these people have already committed crimes against their communities again. And I think if all of us are reasonable, that there's going to be more crimes committed by these people in the future. I do not understand why you would mass pardon people who assaulted police officers. I don't get it. I never will." Then Representative Jefferson Van Andrew, goes on a 5-minute rant about how all of this is political and then poses some sort of a question to Jack Smith that Jack Smith doesn't understand. And Jack Smith says, "I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you were asking." Rep. Raskin enters it into the record soon after that dialogue between Vandrew and Jack Smith, that Representative Vandrew's statement right after January 6th was that it was unacceptable, un-American, and disrespectful to democracy. So the person sitting there blaming Jack Smith for politicizing this investigation said that what happened on January 6th was unacceptable, un-American, and disrespectful of democracy. And then you have Officer Fanone coughs, "Go fuck yourself" to Troy Nehls when Nehls blames Capitol Police leadership for January 6th. This was a far more colorful hearing than the first one because the GOP didn't play these political tricks during the closed-door hearing. They're doing it now. They did it now in this public hearing because everybody's eyes and their audience of one, Donald Trump's eyes, were on what they were asking. Representative Nehls, you were all unprepared to deal with that day. Your leadership failed to share the intelligence with you. It was their fault, folks. And then he blames U.S. Capitol Police, which I think is absolutely hogwash. Then Vandrew says, Trump asked Pelosi for the National Guard. And Raskin here interjects and saying, "Are you saying Nancy Pelosi controls the National Guard? You know she doesn't." And so then there was order asked for the court, but for the hearing, but that was spoken into the congressional record that Nancy Pelosi does not control the National Guard. And Vandrew was trying to put that false narrative into the congressional record. Representative Kamal Gardab, Donald Trump has not and is still not telling the truth about the 2020 elections. In fact, there's a January 6th page on the taxpayer-funded White House website that says that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, a blatant lie he knows is totally false. Moskowitz then goes on to say that the pre-whitewashing statements of the GOP, I heard some of my colleagues call you, Mr. Smith, a hypocrite. Here's what they said about the January 6th riots. Chairman Jordan, stop the violence, support police. Ted Cruz, those storming the Capitol need to stop right now. The Constitution protects, but not violence. Chip Roy, today the People's House was attacked, which is an attack on the Republic itself. Steve Scalise, United States Capitol Police saved my life. Lindsey Graham, when it comes to accountability, the president needs to understand that his actions were the problem. Troy Nails, who is now blaming the officers for January 6th, said, I'm happy to stand shoulder to shoulder with Capitol Police. Darrell Issa, who said he was disgusted by Jack Smith, said that the violence and turmoil we witnessed in Washington was completely unacceptable. Rep. McClintock said the attack on the Capitol strikes at the most sacred act of our democracy. And then Speaker Kevin McCarthy said, let me be clear, last week's violent attack on the Capitol was undemocratic, un-American, and criminal, and make no mistake, those who are responsible should be brought to justice. The president bears responsibility. That's what McCarthy said after this incident happened. Then Representative Balint asks, do you believe that the President Trump's DOJ will find something and some way to indict you? Jack Smith, I believe that they will do everything in their power to do that because they have been ordered to do that by the president. Jack Smith says, if we don't hold the most powerful in our society to the same standards of the rule of law, it can be catastrophic. Because if they don't have to follow the law, it is very easy to understand why regular people, would think they don't have to follow the law as well. So these are the excerpts from the second Jack Smith hearing, the first public one. You didn't hear much of Republican questioning because they would ask the question and then interrupt Jack Smith. They would ask a question and then interrupt Jack Smith. And they filled the congressional record with their false narrative instead of allowing Jack Smith to correct the narrative. And that's why you didn't hear much about Republicans asking questions in this particular hearing and in this particular summary, especially because why would I read up those questions and tell you about them if Smith didn't get an opportunity to answer those questions? With that said, thank you so much for listening. Remember to keep track of what's happening to our country. Never forget what happened on January 6th. Know that Jack Smith is a hero for what he has done and continues to do. Officers Dunn, Hodges, Fanone, and Sergeant Gonell, and over 140 police officers who were injured during January 6th are heroes, and we must never forget them. Officer Brian Sicknick died as a result of this. Other officers died as well because of the insurrection. One of Donald Trump's foot soldiers, Ashley Babbitt, also died in this insurrection. So let's keep the truth alive. No matter how much Donald Trump and his co-conspirators and his foot soldiers try to change the narrative, even today, over 5 years after January 6, 2021. Thank you for listening. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll talk to you soon.